The medieval papacy, far from being a continuous story of sanctity and moral authority, was often marked by scandal, excess, violence, and political intrigue, reflecting the turbulent world in which it existed. One of the earliest and most shocking figures was Fey Pope Stephen V, whose hatred for his predecessor led to the infamous Cadaver Synod in 897, where the decomposed corpse of Fey Pope Formosus Fey was exhumed, dressed in papal robes, placed on trial, declared guilty, mutilated, and thrown into the Tiber River, an event that horrified even contemporaries. Moral decay reached another extreme during the so-called Saculum Obscurum, or Panocracy, when Roman noble families effectively controlled the papacy. Fey Pope John XIII became the embodiment of this corruption. Ascending the papal throne as a teenager, he was accused by his own clergy of turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel, committing adultery, incest, gambling, blinding enemies, and invoking pagan gods, eventually dying under mysterious circumstances, possibly after being beaten by an enraged husband. The papacy continued to be entangled in crime and brutality under Fey Pope Benedict I Fey, one of the youngest and most infamous popes in history, who reportedly lived a life of extreme debauchery, committed acts of violence, and shockingly sold the papal office for money, only to attempt reclaiming it later, resulting in a period where three rival popes claimed legitimacy simultaneously. Violence also stained the reputation of Fey Pope Boniface VIII, whose ruthless assertion of papal supremacy brought him into direct conflict with secular rulers, especially the French crown, culminating in his arrest and humiliation at Anagni, an event that symbolized the decline of papal authority. Personal immorality combined with political manipulation became even more visible during the Renaissance papacy, which, while technically late medieval in spirit, inherited centuries of corruption. Fey Pope Innocent VIII openly acknowledged having numerous illegitimate children and used his position to secure wealth and marriages for them, eroding the moral credibility of the Church. Few figures, however, matched the notoriety of Fey Pope Alexander V, whose papacy epitomized scandal through blatant nepotism, lavish excess, political assassinations, and the open promotion of his children, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, amid rumours of poisonings, orgies, and incest that spread across Europe. Even popes known for intellectual or administrative skill were not free from controversy. Fey Pope Urban V Fey was infamous for his violent temper and paranoia, allegedly torturing and executing cardinals who opposed him, helping trigger the Western Schism, during which rival popes excommunicated one another and divided Christendom for decades. The schism itself exposed the deeply political nature of the papacy, with figures like Fey Pope John XIII, latter declared an antipope accused of piracy, murder, rape, and selling church offices, reinforcing the perception of a church leadership obsessed with power rather than piety. Throughout the Middle Ages, simony, the buying and selling of church positions, was rampant. Clerical celibacy was routinely ignored, and popes frequently waged wars, commanded armies, and plotted assassinations, blurring any line between spiritual leadership and secular tyranny. These scandals did not go unnoticed. Chroniclers, reformers, and ordinary believers alike expressed outrage and despair, laying the groundwork for reform movements and, eventually, the Protestant Reformation. Yet despite the depravity of many individual popes, the institution itself survived, reshaped by repeated crises, reforms, and resistance. standing as a reminder that the medieval papacy was not a monolithic symbol of holiness, but a human institution deeply entangled in the sins, ambitions, and violence of its age. The list of scandalous medieval popes grows even longer when one looks beyond the most famous names and examines the daily realities of how the papacy functioned in a violent, feudal, and deeply corrupt society. Fey Pope Sergius III is often cited as the true beginning of the papal Dark Age, having allegedly ordered the murder of his predecessor and maintained an illicit relationship with the powerful Roman noblewoman Marozia, with medieval sources claiming he fathered a child who later became Pope himself. That child, Fey Pope John Schifei, ruled largely as a puppet, imprisoned by rival factions and stripped of meaningful authority, illustrating how the papacy had become a prize to be seized by aristocratic families rather than a spiritual office earned by merit. Nepotism was not merely tolerated but expected. Popes routinely elevated nephews, brothers, and sons to cardinalships, granting them lands, titles, and armies, turning the church into a hereditary power structure disguised as divine governance. Fey Pope Leo, Igfey, though remembered as a reformer, still personally led troops into battle and was captured by Norman forces, a reminder that even well-intentioned popes operated within a culture where warfare was a normal extension of papal authority. Sexual scandal was equally pervasive. Chroniclers accused Fey Pope Paul II of vanity, cruelty, and maintaining young male favourites, while rumours surrounding lavish feasts and extravagant costumes fueled public resentment. Fey Pope Sixtus IV transformed Rome into a family enterprise, appointing multiple nephews as cardinals, and backing the infamous Pazzi conspiracy to assassinate the ruling Medici family during Mass, an act that shocked Europe and demonstrated how papal politics could spill blood even inside sacred spaces. The use of poison, betrayal, and secret executions became an open secret of papal courts, where enemies rarely died of natural causes. Papal armies pillaged towns, levied crushing taxes, and enforced loyalty through fear, often behaving no differently from secular warlords. Fey Pope Julius II, though admired for his patronage of art, personally wore armour and led military campaigns, leaving many contemporaries questioning how the successor of St. Peter had become indistinguishable from a battlefield general. Corruption extended into the spiritual economy of the church itself. Indulgences were sold aggressively to fund wars, palaces, and lavish lifestyles, while bishops and abbots purchased their offices outright, knowing the investment would pay for itself through fees and tithes. The papal court became notorious for bribery, where justice could be bought, sins forgiven for the right price, and rival claims silenced with gold. Fey Pope Clement V moved the papacy to France under heavy political pressure, beginning the Avignon papacy, a period widely criticised for its luxury, moral laxity, and submission to royal influence. Rome itself fell into decay while popes lived in splendour along the RH Faini, earning the nickname the Babylonian captivity of the Church from outraged critics. The perception that popes were servants of kings rather than God eroded trust across Christendom and encouraged open defiance. Violence within the Church reached grotesque extremes when dissenting clergy were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Cardinals were not safe. Conspiracies, imprisonments, and sudden deaths were part of papal politics. Fey Pope Gregory VII, though a moral reformer, plunged Europe into chaos during the investiture controversy, excommunicating emperors and encouraging rebellion. showing how spiritual authority could destabilize entire kingdoms. Ordinary believers, meanwhile, watched as popes lived in luxury while preaching poverty and chastity, creating a growing gap between doctrine and reality. Satirical poems, angry sermons, and reformist writings circulated widely, mocking papal hypocrisy and calling Rome a den of thieves. By the late Middle Ages, faith in the moral authority of the papacy had been deeply scarred. The spectacle of rival popes during the Western Schism, each claiming divine legitimacy while cursing the others, shattered the idea of a unified church guided by God. Scandal was no longer an exception, but an expectation. And even sincere believers struggled to reconcile their devotion with the behavior of those at the top. These centuries of excess, crime, and moral failure did not destroy the church, but they permanently altered how it was viewed, planting seeds of skepticism and reform that would later explode into full rebellion. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages stand as stark evidence that the papacy, despite its sacred claims, was shaped as much by human ambition, fear, and corruption as by faith, making its history as disturbing as it is fascinating. Even deeper into the medieval record, the behavior of certain popes becomes so extreme that it bordered on the unbelievable. Yet contemporary chronicles confirm much of it. Fey Pope John X Fey rose to power through an alleged sexual relationship with the powerful Roman noblewoman Theodora, and later met a violent end suffocated with a pillow while imprisoned by political rivals, illustrating how intrigue and assassination were routine elements of papal succession. Fey Pope Lando Fey, though ruling briefly, was another product of factional violence, elevated not for holiness, but for loyalty to armed Roman clans. The papacy during this era functioned less like a spiritual institution and more like a mafia-controlled throne, where murder, bribery, and sexual leverage determined who wore the tiara. Fey Pope Anastasius III presided over Rome, while real power lay entirely in the hands of aristocratic families, reinforcing the idea that popes were often symbolic figureheads, while corruption flourished unchecked behind the scenes. The normalization of sexual misconduct was particularly damaging. Chroniclers accused Fey Pope Adrian de Thèche of allowing his wife and daughter to live openly with him in the Lateran. As this long inheritance of experience settled into something almost instinctive, medieval society came to regard the papacy less as a moral compass and more as a fixed terrain, dangerous in places, unavoidable everywhere. People learned how to move within it carefully, aware of its power but wary of its promises. This was not indifference. It was adaptation refined over centuries. When an institution repeatedly fails to align its claims with its conduct, the human response is not endless outrage, but emotional recalibration. Expectations shrink to fit reality. This recalibration reshaped the very meaning of loyalty. Loyalty no longer implied admiration or trust. It implied compliance and caution. Medieval Christians remained loyal to the Church because it framed their world, not because it consistently inspired them. Loyalty became pragmatic rather than heartfelt. People stayed because leaving felt impossible, not because staying felt affirming. This distinction mattered deeply because it transformed loyalty from devotion into habit, from belief into routine. The papacy's long survival under scandal also altered how people understood responsibility for moral order. Instead of expecting justice and virtue to flow downward from authority, people increasingly assumed responsibility upward from themselves. moral life became decentralized. Conscience, community, and personal discipline filled the space where leadership credibility had eroded. This decentralization preserved ethical seriousness, but it fragmented moral unity. Christianity remained intense, yet it became less cohesive, bound together by doctrine and ritual rather than shared trust in leadership. Over time, the papacy's own language of certainty began to feel disconnected from lived reality. Declarations of divine will, absolute truth, and spiritual supremacy continued unchanged, but they floated above a world shaped by memory. People heard these claims with an inner reservation learned from history. They did not reject them outright, they contextualized them. Words were weighed against precedent, not accepted on authority alone. This habit of contextual listening was one of the Middle Ages' quiet intellectual achievements, born not from theory, but from survival. The persistence of scandal also reshaped the emotional economy of fear and hope. Fear remained powerful, fear of punishment, exclusion, damnation. But hope shifted away from institutions. Hope attached itself to saints, pilgrimages, private prayer, and the promise of divine justice beyond history. The Pope could threaten, command, and regulate, but he rarely inspired hope. Hope is fragile, it seeks credibility. Over centuries of contradiction, the papacy ceased to feel like a credible source of it. This emotional redistribution had consequences for how people imagined holiness. Holiness was no longer associated with proximity to power, but with distance from it. Withdrawal became a moral gesture. Simplicity became a sign of sincerity. The more insulated a leader appeared, the less believable his virtue seemed. This inversion profoundly challenged the papacy's self-image. The office claimed supreme holiness. Yet holiness was increasingly imagined elsewhere, at the margins, in suffering, in renunciation. The papacy's inability to reconcile this inversion with its claims produced a defensive posture that hardened over time. Authority emphasized obedience precisely because trust was thin. Structure compensated for credibility. Law replaced example. The institution learned how to function without love, relying instead on fear of chaos and the weight of tradition. This strategy worked in the short term and even in the long term, but it carried a hidden cost. Authority that is obeyed without trust gradually loses its moral voice. It can command action, but it cannot shape conscience. What makes this history so striking is how quietly it unfolded. There was no single collapse, no universal revolt. Instead, there was a slow education in realism. People learned not to expect coherence between power and virtue. They learned that institutions could be sacred in claim and deeply human in behavior. They learned to believe while doubting, to obey while remembering, to hope while guarding their hearts. This quiet learning changed Europe more deeply than any dramatic rupture could have. By the later Middle Ages, this realism had become second nature. The papacy was accepted as an ancient force whose presence shaped life, but whose moral example was unreliable. People did not need to be told this. They knew it through inherited memory. History functioned as a teacher, and its lessons were absorbed emotionally rather than intellectually. The past whispered caution into every promise of renewal. The final consequence of this long experience was a permanent alteration in how authority itself was imagined. Authority was no longer seen as inherently trustworthy simply because it was ancient, sacred, or powerful. It had to be watched, tested, and restrained. If not institutionally, then inwardly through conscience. This insight did not dissolve authority, but it deprived it of innocence. Power could still rule, but it could no longer expect unquestioned belief. The medieval papacy survived its scandals, but survival came at the cost of transformation. It emerged as an institution respected for its endurance rather than its virtue, feared for its power rather than loved for its example. Faith endured alongside it, but no longer because of it. Christianity adapted by becoming more inward, more guarded, and more alert to the dangers of idealizing leaders. In the end, the scandalous popes of the Middle Ages did something more consequential than any single act of corruption. They trained an entire civilization to live without illusions about power. They taught, through repetition rather than instruction, that holiness cannot be assumed from office, that authority without accountability breeds distance, and that endurance is not the same as moral truth. This lesson, learned slowly and painfully across centuries, became one of the most durable inheritances of the medieval world. A legacy not of disbelief, but of watchfulness, carried forward long after the last medieval pope had vanished into history. As this watchfulness became habitual, medieval Christianity entered a phase where belief and authority coexisted without emotional fusion. The faithful no longer felt betrayed when leadership failed, because betrayal implies expectation. Expectation had long since faded. Instead, failure was met with weary recognition. This recognition did not harden people against faith itself. It hardened them against illusion. The Pope could still bless, condemn, and command, but he no longer shaped how people imagined goodness. Moral imagination detached itself from the throne and sought grounding elsewhere. This detachment subtly reshaped the experience of community. The Church remained universal in structure, yet increasingly local in trust. People trusted priests they knew, monasteries they could see, holy figures whose lives felt credible. Rome existed above this world, powerful but abstract. Its presence was legal and symbolic rather than relational. Community survived, but it was sustained horizontally rather than vertically. Faith became something shared among equals more than received from above. The papacy's long record of scandal also altered how people interpreted suffering. When leaders lived insulated lives while preaching sacrifice, suffering ceased to feel redemptive in relation to authority. It became private rather than shared. People bore hardship with seriousness, but without the sense that those above them shared the same moral burden. This separation weakened solidarity between shepherd and flock. Religion still offered meaning, but leadership no longer embodied that meaning. The gap between teaching and lived example widened until it felt structural. Over time, this gap reshaped the emotional meaning of obedience. Obedience became procedural, stripped of affection. People obeyed because it was required, not because it felt right. This form of obedience is durable, but it is brittle. It holds as long as force, habit, or fear sustain it. It does not renew itself through trust. The medieval papacy ruled through this brittle obedience for centuries, mistaking its persistence for health. The irony is that this very brittleness encouraged the survival of belief. By learning not to depend emotionally on leaders, believers insulated their faith from institutional failure. Christianity endured precisely because it adapted to disappointment. It became inwardly strong while outwardly compliant. This adaptation preserved religion, but it also ensured that authority would never again enjoy unquestioned trust. Once people learn how to believe without idealizing leaders, that skill is not forgotten. The papacy's claims to absolute authority increasingly collided with this lived reality. Absolute claims require absolute credibility, and credibility had been eroded by history. The result was tension rather than collapse. The Pope claimed supremacy, the faithful complied cautiously. The system functioned, but it no longer convinced. Authority could demand loyalty, but it could not inspire devotion. This distinction mattered deeply, because devotion is the soil in which moral leadership grows. Without it, authority becomes mechanical. As centuries passed, this mechanical authority shaped political culture more broadly. Rulers learned that legitimacy could be maintained through ritual, law, and continuity, even when moral credibility faltered. The medieval papacy became an unintentional instructor in the art of endurance without reform. It showed how power could absorb criticism, outlast outrage, and continue unchanged. This lesson spread beyond religion, influencing how authority was exercised and resisted across Europe. As this long process reached its deepest layer, medieval Christianity settled into a state of guarded maturity, shaped not by idealism, but by experience. The papacy was no longer expected to redeem itself. It was expected to persist. That expectation alone reveals how thoroughly scandal had reshaped belief. Institutions were no longer measured by how closely they reflected divine ideals, but by how long they endured. Longevity became its own justification. If something survived centuries of corruption, many concluded, then it must be unshakable, even if it was no longer admirable. This resignation altered the emotional contract between leaders and the faithful. Earlier Christianity had assumed that authority carried responsibility to inspire. Later, medieval Christianity assumed only that authority would command. Inspiration was sought elsewhere. People invested emotionally in saints, local holy figures, relics, and private devotion, because these felt trustworthy. Rome, by contrast, felt abstract and impersonal. The Pope was a symbol of order, not a companion in spiritual struggle. This emotional withdrawal protected faith, but it also stripped leadership of warmth. Over time, disappointment became normalized wisdom. Parents taught children not to expect virtue from those in power. Clergy learned to preach ideals while privately acknowledging the system's flaws. Ordinary believers learned how to live sincerely inside an imperfect structure without being crushed by it. This quiet wisdom was born of necessity, not cynicism. It allowed people to remain faithful without being naïve. Yet it also carried a cost. Hope narrowed, imagination shrank, and moral ambition retreated from institutions to individuals. The papacy's long immunity to consequence also reshaped the meaning of sin in the public imagination. Sin ceased to be something that necessarily invited correction at the top. It became expected, managed, and absorbed. This normalization weakened the Church's ability to speak convincingly about moral failure. When leaders who sinned visibly remained secure, moral exhortation sounded selective. People still feared sin in their own lives, but they no longer expected justice to be symmetrical. This asymmetry quietly undermined trust in moral order. What is remarkable is that none of this required disbelief. Medieval Christians did not abandon doctrine or sacraments en masse. They adapted emotionally instead. They learned to believe with restraint, Faith became something held carefully, protected from disappointment by lowered expectations. This careful belief was resilient, but it was also heavy. It lacked the lightness that comes from trust. Religion became serious, disciplined, and inward, looking, shaped by caution rather than confidence. The papacy itself appeared locked into a pattern it could neither fully acknowledge nor escape. To admit the depth of accumulated scandal would threaten legitimacy. To ignore it required constant control. The result was a defensive institution skilled at survival, but resistant to self-examination. Authority learned how to manage crises without addressing causes. Each generation repeated the pattern, reinforcing the lesson that power could persist without moral renewal. Over centuries, this repetition hardened into institutional character. This character shaped how the Church was remembered. History no longer told a simple story of divine guidance through holy leaders. It told a complicated story of endurance through contradiction. Chroniclers recorded papal failures alongside theological achievements, leaving future generations with a mixed inheritance. Memory itself became a moral force, reminding people that authority must be weighed against behavior. The past refused to disappear, and in refusing, it educated. The deepest transformation, however, occurred in how people understood obedience. Obedience ceased to be an expression of trust and became a strategy for stability. People obeyed because disobedience was costly, not because obedience felt righteous. This shift did not destroy order, but it hollowed it out. Authority without trust can function, but it cannot nourish. It maintains structure, not meaning. The papacy ruled a world that complied, but did not confide. By the final medieval generations, this condition felt normal. Few remembered a time when the papacy had been morally unambiguous. Scandal was not news, it was context. The faithful lived with eyes open, carrying belief alongside realism. Christianity survived, not because leadership inspired it, but because belief proved adaptable. It learned how to detach without dissolving, how to endure without idealizing. In this sense, the medieval papacy did not merely fail its ideals, it reshaped them. It taught Europe that holiness must be sought apart from power, that authority must be approached with memory, and that institutions can survive long after they cease to deserve trust. These lessons were not theoretical. They were learned through centuries of lived contradiction, and so the ultimate legacy of medieval papal scandal is not simply moral failure, but a permanent change in consciousness. The world emerged from the Middle Ages with a deeper, harder understanding of authority. Faith remained, but innocence was gone. Obedience continued, but admiration did not automatically follow. Power endured, but it did so under the shadow of history. The papacy stood at the center of this transformation, not because it was uniquely corrupt, but because its claims were uniquely absolute. When such claims collided repeatedly with human weakness, the result was not collapse, but awakening. A slow awakening shaped by memory rather than revolt, by endurance rather than outrage. That awakening taught generations a truth that could not be unlearned, that sacred offices do not sanctify those who hold them, and that when power is shielded from accountability, it may rule for centuries while quietly losing the trust that once gave it meaning. As this awakening settled into the deepest layers of medieval thought, it began to influence how people understood time, history, and expectation itself. The future was no longer imagined as a return to some lost purity in Rome, but as a continuation of cautious endurance, Hope shifted away from institutional transformation and toward personal perseverance. People did not expect the papacy to become better. They expected themselves to become stronger. This subtle shift marked a profound psychological adaptation. When authority proves unreliable, survival requires resilience rather than optimism. The papacy's failures also taught medieval society how to live with moral ambiguity. Clear lines between good and evil, sacred and profane, became harder to maintain when those entrusted with guarding them repeatedly crossed them. Instead of rejecting morality, people learned to interpret it flexibly. They understood that righteousness might exist alongside corruption, sincerity alongside hypocrisy. This moral complexity did not make society immoral, it made it wary. Absolute claims were met with internal qualifiers shaped by memory. Over generations, this wariness became cultural instinct. People learned not to confuse legitimacy with virtue. A pope could be legitimate and still be deeply flawed. Authority could be real and yet morally compromised. This distinction, once learned, could not be forgotten. It became a lens through which all power was viewed. The papacy, by its example, trained Europe to question not whether authority existed, but whether it deserved trust. That question lingered long after medieval structures faded. The Church's own teachings about human sinfulness ironically reinforced this outlook. Christianity emphasized that all humans were fallen, yet the papacy often behaved as if its office exempted it from that reality. This contradiction sharpened awareness rather than dulling it. If all were sinners, then power made sin more dangerous, not less. The higher the office, the greater the damage caused by moral failure. This insight quietly undermined the assumption that sacred position guaranteed moral reliability. As a result, holiness increasingly came to be associated with vulnerability rather than power. Saints were admired because they suffered, renounced, and withdrew. The Pope, surrounded by guards and ceremony, appeared insulated from the very struggle that defined authentic faith. This contrast reshaped admiration. People looked upward to heaven, not toward Rome, when they sought moral inspiration. Leadership commanded obedience, but holiness commanded love, and the two no longer met at the top. The papacy's endurance through scandal also reshaped expectations about justice. Justice came to be seen as delayed, uneven, and often absent in this world. Divine judgment was postponed to eternity. Human institutions were not expected to deliver it reliably. This belief allowed people to live with injustice without constant revolt. It also reduced pressure on authority to reform. If justice was ultimately God's domain, then human systems could be tolerated even when flawed. This theological patience helped preserve order, but it also enabled abuse to persist. The long-term emotional effect was a kind of sober realism. Medieval Christianity lost its youthful confidence and gained something closer to hardened wisdom. People believed deeply, but they believed carefully. They trusted God, but not easily those who claimed to speak for him. This careful belief was less exuberant, but more resilient. It could survive disappointment because it no longer depended on idealized leadership. By the close of the Middle Ages, this realism had become second nature. The papacy stood as an ancient monument, respected for its age, feared for its power, but rarely idealized. Its scandals were no longer shocking stories. They were part of the background noise of history. As this transformation settled fully into medieval consciousness, The papacy became less a source of moral guidance and more a fixed reality of the world, like monarchy, war, or famine, something to be navigated rather than trusted. People no longer imagined a future where Rome would suddenly become pure. They imagined only degrees of damage control. This quiet realism shaped expectations so deeply that hope itself changed form. Hope was no longer placed in leaders becoming better, but in individuals becoming resilient. Faith adapted not by demanding integrity from power, but by learning how to survive without it. This adaptation altered the emotional texture of Christianity. Earlier religious life had been infused with confidence that obedience aligned with goodness. By the later Middle Ages, obedience often felt morally neutral, neither good nor bad, simply necessary. The Pope issued commands, the faithful complied, conscience remained private. This separation created a strange duality in religious life. Public conformity paired with inner independence. People learned how to live within the system, while quietly withholding trust from it. This was not hypocrisy, it was self-preservation. The papacy's failures also reshaped the meaning of scandal itself. Scandal no longer shocked because it no longer violated expectation. Instead, it confirmed it. When news spread of corruption, violence, or excess, the reaction was often weary acknowledgement rather than outrage. This emotional fatigue was perhaps the most dangerous outcome of all. A society that expects corruption stops demanding virtue. When demands disappear, reform loses urgency. The system stabilizes around failure. This fatigue extended even to moral language. Concepts like renewal and reform became familiar slogans rather than urgent calls. They circulated endlessly without resolution. Each generation heard the same promises and witnessed the same outcomes. Over time, words lost the power to move hearts. Language survived, but meaning thinned. The Church continued to speak, but fewer truly listened with expectation. Authority spoke into an echo chamber shaped by memory. The psychological cost of this environment was subtle but profound. Believers lived with constant moral dissonance, intense concern for salvation paired with low confidence in leadership. This dissonance was managed by compartmentalization. God was trusted, institutions were tolerated. Spiritual struggle was internal. Political reality was external. The Pope became a distant figure whose actions mattered legally but not spiritually. Faith migrated inward, away from spectacle and power. Ironically, this inward turn preserved Christianity, even as it weakened the papacy's moral role. By separating belief from leadership, medieval Christians protected the core of their faith from institutional failure. Yet this protection came at a cost. The Church lost its ability to unify belief and authority in a single moral vision. What survived was structure without intimacy, command without confidence, continuity without inspiration. The papacy's survival through scandal thus became its defining achievement and its deepest indictment. It proved that an institution could endure repeated moral collapse if it was old enough, powerful enough, and embedded deeply enough in social life. But it also proved that endurance alone does not preserve meaning. Authority can persist while trust evaporates. Power can rule long after it stops convincing. By the end of the Middle Ages, this reality was woven into the cultural fabric. People no longer expected alignment between sacred claims and human behavior. They approached authority with caution, filtered through history. This cautious mindset did not disappear with medieval society. It carried forward into later centuries, shaping how reform movements were received, how leaders were judged, and how claims of absolute authority were questioned. The medieval papacy became a reference point, not for holiness, but for warning. In this sense, the scandalous popes of the Middle Ages left behind a legacy far greater than their individual lives. They reshaped how Western culture understood power itself. They demonstrated that authority must be accountable to retain moral force, and that when it is not, people adapt by withdrawing trust rather than belief. Faith survived, but it survived altered, more guarded, more inward, and less willing to idealize leaders. The final outcome of centuries of papal scandal was not collapse, but distance. Distance between belief and institution, between obedience and admiration, between power and holiness. That distance allowed Christianity to endure, but it also ensured that the papacy would never again be viewed with unexamined innocence. Once history teaches a lesson so thoroughly, it does not unteach it. Thus, the medieval papacy stands as a long caution, written across generations, that sacred authority can command obedience without earning trust. But such authority rules a colder world. It governs behavior, not hearts. It survives, but it does not inspire. And in surviving without healing, it leaves behind a legacy, not of faith destroyed, but of faith forever changed, wiser, more skeptical, and deeply aware that holiness cannot be inherited, enforced, or preserved by power alone. As this long conditioning reached its fullest expression, medieval society developed a deeply pragmatic relationship with sacred authority. The papacy was no longer approached with hope, but with calculation. People learned how to interpret commands in light of precedent, how to comply without internalizing, how to distinguish between what must be done publicly and what could be believed privately. This was not rebellion. It was adaptation refined over generations. When power proves unreliable as a moral guide, survival requires emotional intelligence rather than loyalty. One of the most profound consequences of this adaptation was the quiet reshaping of conscience. Moral responsibility increasingly shifted away from institutions and toward individuals. People trusted their own sense of right and wrong more than the example of leaders. This inward moral compass did not reject doctrine, but it no longer depended on hierarchy for validation. Conscience became a refuge from disappointment. Faith survived because it was relocated to a space authority could not easily contaminate. The papacy, meanwhile, continued to speak the language of universality, but its reach became uneven in emotional terms. It governed bodies more effectively than hearts. Laws were obeyed, taxes paid, rituals performed, yet loyalty was thin. The Pope was feared, respected, and strategically acknowledged, but rarely loved. Love requires trust, and trust had been spent across centuries of contradiction. What remained was obedience without attachment, a stable but lifeless form of authority. This condition produced a subtle loneliness at the heart of the institution itself, cut off from genuine trust. The papacy increasingly relied on affirmation from within its own walls. Courtiers, officials, and allies replaced the faithful as mirrors of legitimacy. Praise circulated upward. Criticism was filtered out. Over time, this closed loop hardened self-perception. Leaders surrounded by confirmation lose the ability to hear warning. Survival becomes proof of righteousness. The institution mistakes endurance for approval. The wider Christian world absorbed this pattern as a lesson in power dynamics. People learned that authority rarely reforms itself voluntarily, and that moral renewal, when it happens, usually comes from the margins. Holiness was expected from monks, mystics, and the poor, not from princes or popes. The moral imagination inverted. Distance from power became a sign of integrity. This inversion reshaped admiration. Those who withdrew from authority were trusted more than those who wielded it. This shift also altered how history itself was understood. The past was no longer a sacred inheritance, but a warning archive. Medieval people remembered. They remembered violent successions, broken vows, indulgence markets, political cruelty. Memory functioned as restraint where authority could not. It taught skepticism without requiring disbelief. People could honor tradition while distrusting its stewards. This nuanced relationship with history became one of the Middle Ages' most sophisticated achievements. What is striking is how little of this transformation required explicit critique. It unfolded quietly through experience rather than argument. Disillusionment does not always announce itself. Often it simply changes behavior. People stopped expecting, stopped hoping, stopped being surprised. Expectations flattened. Once flattened, they no longer generated pressure for reform. The system stabilized around disappointment. Authority endured because it no longer promised what it could not deliver. The emotional cost of this endurance was heavy. Faith became serious, disciplined, and cautious. Joy was found in personal devotion rather than communal leadership. Religious life was rich, but burdened. The church offered meaning, but not reassurance. People feared God deeply while remaining emotionally detached from those who claimed to speak most directly for him. This split required constant inner management, a balancing act between belief and realism. In the long view, the medieval papacy did not simply fail morally. It reshaped the conditions under which morality could be trusted. It taught Europe that power must be judged by behavior, not title, that longevity does not equal legitimacy, and that institutions can survive even when they no longer inspire. These lessons did not remain confined to religion. They shaped political thought, social caution, and cultural skepticism long after medieval structures faded. The greatest irony of all is that the papacy's survival, as the medieval world continued to live under this accumulated inheritance, the papacy came to function almost like a weather system, inescapable, powerful, and beyond moral appeal. People adjusted their lives around it rather than placing hope in it. This adaptation did not require conscious rejection. It emerged naturally from experience. When disappointment repeats often enough, expectation quietly dies. The Pope remained a figure of consequence, but not of confidence. His decisions mattered, yet his character felt irrelevant. Authority no longer needed to persuade, it simply existed. This erosion reshaped the inner life of belief in subtle but lasting ways. Medieval Christians became experts at compartmentalization. They learned how to revere sacred texts while doubting sacred officials, how to fear divine judgment while assuming human hypocrisy, how to obey commands without granting emotional loyalty. This inner division was not celebrated, but it became normalized. Faith survived by learning to shield itself from disappointment. and that shielding required distance. Trust became selective, carefully rationed, and rarely extended upward. Over time, the papacy's failures also reshaped the meaning of reform itself. Reform ceased to be imagined as moral renewal, and instead came to mean administrative adjustment. Calls for reform focused on procedure, discipline, and structure rather than repentance or humility. This narrowing of vision reflected exhaustion. People no longer believed that deep change was possible, only that damage could be managed. The system might be improved, but not transformed. Hope was practical, not idealistic. The papacy's long survival amid scandal taught another lesson as well, that power does not require moral coherence to endure. This realization unsettled medieval moral assumptions. If divine authority could coexist with repeated failure, then morality seemed less foundational than tradition and force. This did not destroy belief in good and evil, but it weakened confidence that institutions naturally served them. Moral clarity shifted away from offices and toward individuals. Conscience became more important than command, intention more important than appearance. This inward turn had consequences for community life. Shared trust in leadership weakened, and communal moral vision fragmented. People still gathered for worship, but unity felt formal rather than heartfelt. The church remained one in structure, yet divided in confidence. Different regions, orders, and movements cultivated their own understandings of holiness, often quietly distancing themselves from papal example. Diversity of devotion flourished not because it was encouraged, but because centralized authority had lost moral magnetism. The papacy itself appeared increasingly isolated within its own grandeur. Surrounded by ceremony, law, and tradition, it became insulated from the emotional reality of the faithful. Criticism was interpreted as rebellion, disappointment as disloyalty. This defensive posture hardened over time, making introspection dangerous and change unlikely institutions that cannot hear. Criticism lose the ability to heal. The medieval papacy perfected the art of survival, while slowly losing the capacity for self-correction. What endured was a peculiar imbalance, immense authority paired with fragile trust. This imbalance shaped every interaction between Rome and the wider Christian world. Commands were issued confidently, yet received cautiously. Obedience continued, but enthusiasm faded. The Pope ruled, but he did not lead in the deepest sense. Leadership requires moral credibility, and credibility had been spent across centuries of contradiction. The emotional consequence of this history was a form of religious fatigue. Believers carried the weight of faith alongside the burden of disappointment. They continued to fear God, seek forgiveness, and hope for salvation, but they no longer expected leadership to illuminate the path. Faith became heavier, more serious, less joyful. The church offered structure and meaning, but rarely reassurance that its shepherds shared the same moral struggle as their flock. By the end of the Middle Ages, this fatigue had become cultural memory. It shaped how stories were told, how sermons were heard, how authority was received. People remembered too much to believe easily. The papacy had not lost power, but it had lost the benefit of innocence. Every claim was filtered through history, every promise measured against precedent. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate by decree. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages therefore left behind something deeper than institutional damage. They reshaped the emotional grammar of belief. They taught Europe how to live with authority without trusting it, how to obey without admiration, how to believe without idealizing leaders. This adaptation preserved faith, but it permanently altered its relationship with power. In the end, the medieval papacy stands not only as a record of excess, ambition, and failure, but as a long experiment in what happens when sacred authority outlives moral credibility. The experiment did not end in collapse. It ended in transformation. Faith survived, institutions endured, but trust thinned into caution. Holiness retreated from power, and power learned to stand alone. That legacy did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It lingered as an instinct, a reflexive skepticism toward authority, clothed in sanctity. It shaped future reform, resistance, and reflection. The popes of the medieval world ruled vast spiritual territory, but they also ruled over a growing awareness that authority without accountability can persist indefinitely while quietly emptying itself of meaning. And that awareness, born not from theory, but from centuries of lived contradiction, became one of the most enduring truths medieval history passed on to the modern world. As this awareness hardened into habit, medieval society developed an almost instinctive caution toward claims of sacred authority. The papacy no longer stood at the emotional center of Christian life. It hovered above it, powerful but distant, commanding but rarely comforting. People learned to live under its shadow without expecting light from it. This shift did not happen through argument or rebellion, but through repetition. Each scandal reinforced the last, until contradiction itself became the norm. When something is expected, it ceases to provoke action. The medieval papacy mastered survival precisely because outrage had grown tired. One of the quiet tragedies of this long period was the way moral language itself was weakened. Words like repentance, humility, and holiness were spoken so often by leaders who visibly contradicted them that they began to lose emotional force. They remained theologically meaningful, but psychologically dulled. Believers still feared sin and sought forgiveness, yet they increasingly associated moral struggle with private life rather than public leadership. Virtue became something practiced in spite of authority, not modelled by it. The Pope taught doctrine, but conscience learned elsewhere. This gradual disillusionment reshaped the rhythm of religious life. Ritual continued with seriousness, but without illusion. People attended Mass, fasted, confessed, and prayed, yet they carried an internal distance that earlier generations may not have known. Faith became heavier, more sober, stripped of the naive confidence that leadership and holiness naturally aligned. Medieval Christianity matured under pressure, but that maturity was born from disappointment rather than inspiration. It was resilient, but guarded. The papacy's endurance also created a dangerous precedent that institutions could outlast moral collapse without reform. This lesson extended far beyond religion. Kings, nobles, and later states learned from Rome's example that continuity could substitute for credibility. If the Pope could survive centuries of scandal by leaning on tradition, law, and force, then other powers could do the same. In this sense, medieval papal corruption did not merely reflect its age. It helped teach the age how power could persist without virtue. Authority learned that it did not need trust to rule, only structure. Over time, this realization reshaped how people related to history itself. The past was no longer a golden age to be revered, but a cautionary record to be remembered. Stories of scandal were preserved not just as gossip, but as instruction. Memory became a moral resource. People remembered so they would not be surprised again. This historical consciousness was one of the Middle Ages' most important inheritances. The understanding that institutions accumulate character over time, and that ignoring history invites repetition. The papacy's greatest failure, then, was not merely moral weakness, but moral insulation. Shielded by ceremony and hierarchy, it rarely encountered the full consequences of its actions. Suffering flowed downward. Accountability did not flow upward. This imbalance ensured that scandal could recur without resolution. Without genuine reckoning, there could be no healing. Only management crises were handled, not understood. Outrage was outlasted, not answered. The system learned to wait for anger to fade. For ordinary believers, this created a subtle but lasting tension. They lived under teachings that emphasized self-examination, repentance, and fear of judgment, while watching leaders who seemed untouched by those demands. This asymmetry strained the moral imagination. If judgment was real, why did it appear so selective? If repentance was essential, why was it so invisible at the top? These questions did not always lead to open doubt, but they fostered quiet unease. Faith survived, but certainty fractured. By the late medieval period, the papacy had become a paradox fully absorbed. As the medieval world continued to live under this accumulated inheritance, the papacy came to function almost like a weather system, inescapable, powerful, and beyond moral appeal. People adjusted their lives around it rather than placing hope in it. This adaptation did not require conscious rejection. It emerged naturally from experience. When disappointment repeats often enough, expectation quietly dies. The Pope remained a figure of consequence, but not of confidence. His decisions mattered, yet his character felt irrelevant. Authority no longer needed to persuade, it simply existed. This erosion reshaped the inner life of belief, in subtle but lasting ways. Medieval Christians became experts at compartmentalization. They learned how to revere sacred texts while doubting sacred officials, how to fear divine judgment, while assuming human hypocrisy, how to obey commands without granting emotional loyalty. This inner division was not celebrated, but it became normalized. Faith survived by learning to shield itself from disappointment, and that shielding required distance. Trust became selective, carefully rationed, and rarely extended upward. Over time, the papacy's failures also reshaped the meaning of reform itself. Reform ceased to be imagined as moral renewal, and instead came to mean administrative adjustment. Calls for reform focused on procedure, discipline, and structure, rather than repentance or humility. This narrowing of vision reflected exhaustion. People no longer believed that deep change was possible, only that damage could be managed. The system might be improved, but not transformed. Hope was practical, not idealistic. The papacy's long survival amid scandal taught another lesson as well, that power does not require moral coherence to endure. This realization unsettled medieval moral assumptions. If divine authority could coexist with repeated failure, then morality seemed less foundational than tradition and force. This did not destroy belief in good and evil, but it weakened confidence that institutions naturally served them. Moral clarity shifted away from offices and toward individuals. Conscience became more important than command, intention more important than appearance. This inward turn had consequences for community life. Shared trust in leadership weakened and communal moral vision fragmented. People still gathered for worship, but unity felt formal rather than heartfelt. The church remained one in structure, yet divided in confidence. Different regions, orders, and movements cultivated their own understandings of holiness, often quietly distancing themselves from papal example. Diversity of devotion flourished not because it was encouraged, but because centralized authority had lost moral magnetism. The papacy itself appeared increasingly isolated within its own grandeur. Surrounded by ceremony, law, and tradition, it became insulated from the emotional reality of the faithful. Criticism was interpreted as rebellion, disappointment as disloyalty. This defensive posture hardened over time, making introspection dangerous and change unlikely. Institutions that cannot hear criticism lose the ability to heal. The medieval papacy perfected the art of survival while slowly losing the capacity for self-correction. What endured was a peculiar imbalance. Immense authority paired with fragile trust. This imbalance shaped every interaction between Rome and the wider Christian world. Commands were issued confidently, yet received cautiously. Obedience continued, but enthusiasm faded. The Pope ruled, but he did not lead in the deepest sense. Leadership requires moral credibility, and credibility had been spent across centuries of contradiction. The emotional consequence of this history was a form of religious fatigue. Believers carried the weight of faith alongside the burden of disappointment. They continued to fear God, seek forgiveness, and hope for salvation, but they no longer expected leadership to illuminate the path. Faith became heavier, more serious, less joyful. The church offered structure and meaning, but rarely reassurance that its shepherds shared the same moral struggle as their flock. By the end of the Middle Ages, this fatigue had become cultural memory. It shaped how stories were told, how sermons were heard, how authority was received. People remembered too much to believe easily. The papacy had not lost power, but it had lost the benefit of innocence. Every claim was filtered through history, every promise measured against precedent. Trust, once broken repeatedly, does not regenerate by decree. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages therefore left behind something deeper than institutional damage. They reshaped the emotional grammar of belief. They taught Europe how to live with authority without trusting it, how to obey without admiration, how to believe without idealizing leaders. This adaptation preserved faith, but it permanently altered its relationship with power. In the end, the medieval papacy stands not only as a record of excess, ambition, and failure, but as a long experiment in what happens when sacred authority outlives moral credibility. The experiment did not end in collapse. It ended in transformation. Faith survived, institutions endured, but trust thinned into caution. Holiness retreated from power, and power learned to stand alone. That legacy did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It lingered as an instinct, a reflexive skepticism toward authority clothed in sanctity. It shaped future reform, resistance, and reflection. The popes of the medieval world ruled vast spiritual territory, but they also ruled over a growing awareness that authority without accountability can persist indefinitely, while quietly emptying itself of meaning. And that awareness, born not from theory but from centuries of lived contradiction, became one of the most enduring truths medieval history passed on to the modern world. As this awareness hardened into habit, medieval society developed an almost instinctive caution toward claims of sacred authority. The papacy no longer stood at the emotional center of Christian life. It hovered above it, powerful but distant, commanding but rarely comforting. People learned to live under its shadow without expecting light from it. This shift did not happen through argument or rebellion, but through repetition. Each scandal reinforced the last until contradiction itself became the norm. When something is expected, it ceases to provoke action. The medieval papacy mastered survival precisely because outrage had grown tired. One of the quiet tragedies of this long period was the way moral language itself was weakened. Words like repentance, humility, and holiness were spoken so often by leaders who visibly contradicted them that they began to lose emotional force. They remained theologically meaningful, but psychologically dulled. Believers still feared sin and sought forgiveness, yet they increasingly associated moral struggle with private life rather than public leadership. Virtue became something practiced in spite of authority, not modelled by it. The Pope taught doctrine, but conscience learned elsewhere. This gradual disillusionment reshaped the rhythm of religious life. Ritual continued with seriousness, but without illusion. People attended Mass, fasted, confessed, and prayed, yet they carried an internal distance that earlier generations may not have known. Faith became heavier, more sober, stripped of the naive confidence that leadership and holiness naturally aligned. Medieval Christianity matured under pressure, but that maturity was born from disappointment rather than inspiration. It was resilient but guarded. The papacy's endurance also created a dangerous precedent, that institutions could outlast moral collapse without reform. This lesson extended far beyond religion. Kings, nobles, and later states learned from Rome's example that continuity could substitute for credibility. If the Pope could survive centuries of scandal by leaning on tradition, law, and force, then other powers could do the same. In this sense, medieval papal corruption did not merely reflect its age. It helped teach the age how power could persist without virtue. Authority learned that it did not need trust to rule, only structure. Over time, this realization reshaped how people related to history itself. The past was no longer a golden age to be revered, but a cautionary record to be remembered. Stories of scandal were preserved not just as gossip, but as instruction. Memory became a moral resource. People remembered so they would not be surprised again. This historical consciousness was one of the Middle Ages' most important inheritances. The understanding that institutions accumulate character over time, and that ignoring history invites repetition. The papacy's greatest failure, then, was not merely moral weakness, but moral insulation. Shielded by ceremony and hierarchy, it rarely encountered the full consequences of its actions. Suffering flowed downward, accountability did not flow upward. This imbalance ensured that scandal could recur without resolution. Without genuine reckoning, there could be no healing, only management. Crises were handled, not understood. Outrage was outlasted, not answered. The system learned to wait for anger to fade. For ordinary believers, this created a subtle but lasting tension. They lived under teachings that emphasized self-examination, repentance, and fear of judgment, while watching leaders who seemed untouched by those demands. This asymmetry strained the moral imagination. If judgment was real, why did it appear so selective? If repentance was essential, why was it so invisible at the top? These questions did not always lead to open doubt, but they fostered quiet unease. Faith survived, but certainty fractured. By the late medieval period, the papacy had become a paradox fully absorbed. As this long history settled into the bloodstream of medieval society, the papacy gradually ceased to be imagined as a moral summit, and instead came to resemble a permanent structure of power, ancient, unavoidable, and deeply human. People no longer asked whether Rome could fail. They asked only how it would fail next. The idea that corruption was episodic vanished, replaced by the assumption that it was cyclical. This assumption shaped emotional responses. Disappointment replaced shock. Cynicism replaced outrage. The papacy no longer fell from grace in the eyes of the faithful, because, in their lived memory, it had never fully occupied it. One of the most revealing consequences of this shift was the way moral responsibility was redistributed. When leadership repeatedly failed, individuals were forced to take greater ownership of their own spiritual lives. Conscience became more important than command. Inner intention mattered more than public conformity. This was not a rejection of Christianity, but a recalibration of how it was lived. People learned to survive spiritually without trusting those at the top. The Pope remained an authority over law and ritual, but the soul increasingly answered to something more private and inward. The papacy's relationship with truth itself also suffered under the weight of scandal. Official narratives often conflicted with lived experience, and believers learned to read papal statements critically rather than reverently. Declarations of unity followed periods of division. Condemnations of sin followed public excess. Calls for sacrifice followed displays of wealth. Over time, words lost their binding force. Authority remained, but credibility thinned. People listened, but they filtered. Faith learned to coexist with doubt, not as rebellion, but as self-defense. This long erosion also changed how holiness was imagined. Instead of associating sanctity with office, medieval Christians increasingly associated it with withdrawal from power. Saints were admired precisely because they rejected wealth, authority, and influence. Monks, hermits, mystics, and martyrs came to embody ideals the papacy no longer represented. The closer one was to power, the less trustworthy one appeared. This inversion was devastating for an institution that claimed supreme spiritual authority, because it meant that holiness was now imagined at the margins rather than the centre. The papacy itself appeared trapped by its own continuity. Each new pope inherited not only power, but expectation. Expectation of compromise, calculation, and control. The office trained its occupants in survival rather than self-examination. To rule was to navigate threats, alliances, and revenue, leaving little space for moral reckoning. Over time, this produced leaders skilled in governance but disconnected from the spiritual meaning of their role. The papacy became expert at preserving itself, even as it lost the trust that once justified its claims. What made this condition so enduring was its gradualness. There was no single moment when belief collapsed or authority was rejected. Instead, faith adapted quietly. People learned to believe without trusting, to obey without admiring, to participate without expecting integrity from above. This quiet adjustment allowed the church to endure, but it also hollowed out the emotional bond between leaders and the faithful. Authority survived, but affection did not. The legacy of medieval papal scandal then was not destruction, but distortion. Christianity continued, but it bent inward. Power remained, but it was increasingly questioned. The papacy stood, but it stood alone, separated from the moral imagination of the people it ruled. Its voice still carried weight, but it no longer carried innocence. History had taught too many lessons for that. In the end, the scandalous popes of the Middle Ages did something no single reformer or critic could have done. They taught Europe to live with contradiction. They demonstrated, again and again, that sacred authority could coexist with profound moral failure, and that institutions could endure long after trust had eroded. This lesson reshaped not only religion, but attitudes toward power itself. The medieval papacy survived its scandals, but survival came at a price, the permanent loss of moral simplicity. What remained was an institution crowned by history, protected by tradition, and burdened by memory. Faith endured because it learned to separate itself from leadership. Authority endured because it learned to outlast criticism, but trust, deep, unguarded trust, became rare. That loss was the true cost of centuries of scandal, and it left behind an enduring truth, learned slowly and painfully, that holiness cannot be enforced by position, preserved by ceremony, or guaranteed by age, and that when power is left unexamined, even the most sacred offices can become shadows of the ideals they were meant to serve. As this long medieval pattern deepened, the papacy increasingly resembled a structure that survived by inertia rather than conviction. Its authority was inherited, not earned anew, renewed automatically with each succession, regardless of character. This created a dangerous illusion of permanence. Because the institution endured, its leaders assumed legitimacy, even when their behavior contradicted the very principles they defended. Over time, endurance itself was mistaken for righteousness. Survival became proof of divine favor, and the fact that scandals did not destroy the papacy was interpreted not as warning, but as validation. This logic insulated the institution from self-doubt and made genuine repentance almost unthinkable at the highest level. What is especially striking is how thoroughly scandal reshaped emotional expectations. Medieval believers learned not to be emotionally invested in papal virtue. Hope was redirected away from Rome and toward heaven, saints, or personal devotion. This emotional withdrawal was subtle but decisive. People stopped expecting moral leadership from those in power, and once expectation disappears, disappointment no longer motivates reform. The papacy continued to command obedience, but it no longer stirred the conscience. Authority functioned without moral intimacy, and that separation became normal. This normalization of disappointment had long-term consequences for how truth was received. When popes spoke, their words were weighed against history rather than trusted on principle. Statements of reform were met with cautious silence, not enthusiasm. Condemnations of sin were filtered through memory, stripped of urgency by the knowledge that similar words had been spoken before without lasting change. Language lost its transformative power. It could command action, but it could not restore confidence. Speech survived. Credibility did not. The cumulative effect was a culture trained to endure contradiction. Medieval Christians became adept at living with unresolved tension between belief and leadership. They did not resolve the contradiction. They managed it. This management shaped daily religious life, encouraging compliance without emotional surrender. People followed rules while guarding their inner trust. Faith remained intense, but it was increasingly private, protected from institutional disappointment by distance and restraint. Even reverence itself changed character. Earlier reverence had been rooted in admiration and awe. Later, reverence was formal, cautious, and detached. Ritual continued, but its emotional resonance weakened. Sacred acts were performed faithfully, yet without the assumption that those presiding over them embodied their meaning. This did not empty ritual of significance, but it shifted its focus away from leadership and toward tradition itself. The ritual mattered because it had always mattered, not because the leader performing it was trusted. The papacy's inability to confront its own history compounded this effect. Scandals were rarely acknowledged as part of a larger pattern. Instead, they were treated as isolated incidents, or blamed on enemies, circumstances, or necessity. This refusal to integrate memory into self, understanding prevented healing. Institutions, like individuals, cannot recover from repeated failure without honest reckoning. The medieval papacy avoided reckoning by leaning on continuity, allowing time to bury outrage without addressing causes. Memory remained among the people, but accountability did not. As a result, the papacy became an institution haunted by its own past. It carried authority shaped by centuries, but also suspicion shaped by the same centuries. Every action was interpreted against accumulated experience. Trust, once broken repeatedly, did not regenerate automatically. The office still commanded respect, but it did so in a colder, more transactional way. People obeyed because the structure endured, not because they believed it deserved obedience. In this sense, the greatest damage inflicted by medieval papal scandal was psychological rather than institutional. The church did not collapse. Belief did not vanish. What disappeared was innocence. Once lost, innocence does not return. Faith matured into caution, devotion into guarded loyalty. People learned that sacred claims must be tested against behavior, and that power, even when ancient and revered, requires scrutiny. This awareness did not destroy Christianity, but it permanently altered its relationship with authority. By the close of the Middle Ages, the papacy stood as a monument to endurance rather than virtue. Its survival testified to its political skill and historical weight, not to its moral clarity. It ruled a world that had learned slowly and painfully to distinguish between God and those who claimed to speak most directly for him. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages thus left behind more than a record of excess. They left behind a transformed consciousness. As the long medieval experience continued to weigh on European consciousness, the papacy came to symbolize a troubling contradiction that people learned to live with rather than resolve. It was simultaneously sacred and compromised, authoritative and suspect, indispensable and disappointing. This contradiction did not provoke constant rebellion, because it had become familiar. Generations were born into a world where papal power was immense, but papal virtue uncertain, and this familiarity shaped emotional expectations. People no longer expected moral clarity from Rome. They expected management, survival, and dominance. The Pope was not asked to be wholly so much as effective. This quiet recalibration of expectations had subtle consequences for belief itself. Faith became increasingly internalized, rooted in conscience, prayer, and personal discipline rather than confidence in leadership. External authority still mattered, but it no longer defined the whole of religious life. Many medieval Christians learned to hold two truths at once: that the Church was divinely founded, and that its leaders were deeply flawed. Holding these ideas together required mental flexibility, a willingness to separate ideals from reality. Over time, this separation became second nature. The language of holiness persisted, but it floated above lived experience rather than shaping it. Sermons about humility rang hollow when contrasted with the spectacle of papal courts. Calls to repentance felt one-sided when issued by men who appeared exempt from consequence. This imbalance fostered quiet irony. People listened, nodded, complied, and remembered. Memory became a form of resistance, preserving awareness of contradiction, even when obedience was unavoidable. In this way, history itself became a moral counterweight to authority. The papacy's own self-understanding was shaped by this environment. Surrounded by ritual affirmation and protected by tradition, popes often encountered little direct challenge. Criticism was filtered out or reframed as disloyalty. Over time, this isolation dulled self-awareness. Power became normalized, and privilege felt deserved rather than dangerous. The office trained its occupants to prioritize stability over introspection, continuity over confession. The result was an institution highly skilled at survival and remarkably poor at self-critique. What made medieval papal scandal especially enduring was its cumulative nature. Each incident alone might have been survivable, but together they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed. The repetition of violence, greed, sexual misconduct, and political manipulation created a moral rhythm that shaped expectations. People learned not to be surprised. Surprise gave way to resignation, and resignation became cultural habit. Once outrage fades, reform becomes harder because nothing feels urgent anymore. Scandal becomes background noise. This long exposure also reshaped how people understood responsibility. If the highest authority could evade accountability, then accountability itself seemed fragile. Moral responsibility shifted downward, away from institutions and toward individuals. People learned to trust their own conscience more than official example. This inward turn preserved sincerity, but it also weakened communal moral leadership. The Church continued to teach, but its teaching increasingly depended on personal interpretation rather than collective confidence. By the later Middle Ages, the papacy functioned as a paradoxical anchor. It provided continuity in a fragmented world, yet it also embodied many of the world's worst tendencies. It stabilized political order, even as it destabilized moral authority. People relied on it while distrusting it, feared it while doubting it. This tension did not break medieval Christianity, but it reshaped it into something more cautious, more inward, and more skeptical of power. The true cost of centuries of scandal was not simply reputational damage, but emotional distance. The Pope ceased to feel like a shepherd and came to resemble a ruler. Love gave way to compliance, admiration to calculation. This emotional shift mattered deeply because faith thrives on trust. When trust erodes, belief adapts defensively. The medieval believer learned to guard faith from disappointment by lowering expectations of leadership. This adaptation kept belief alive, but it also normalized disappointment as part of religious life. In the end, the medieval papacy stands as a lesson written slowly across time. It shows how institutions can endure even as their moral authority thins, how power can persist without trust, and how sacred language can survive repeated contradiction. The scandalous popes of the Middle Ages did not merely fail as individuals. They shaped a culture of guarded belief and cautious obedience. Their legacy was not collapse, but transformation, a shift from innocence to awareness, from reverence to realism. That transformation did not end with the Middle Ages. It carried forward into later centuries, influencing how people questioned authority, demanded accountability, and separated faith from office. The medieval papacy survived its scandals, but it did so changed, permanently marked by the knowledge that holiness cannot be assumed from power, and that authority, once stripped of credibility, can rule for generations while quietly losing the trust that gives it meaning. As the medieval centuries accumulated, the papacy's moral exhaustion began to feel almost geological, layered over time rather than inflicted by any single disaster. Each generation inherited not only doctrines and rituals, but also a quiet awareness that the highest authority in Christendom was deeply compromised. This awareness did not usually manifest as open rebellion. Instead, it expressed itself as lowered expectations. People no longer looked to Rome for inspiration, only for regulation. The Pope became an administrator of salvation rather than a living symbol of it, a manager of structures rather than a witness to holiness. This shift subtly altered the emotional tone of medieval Christianity. Awe gave way to caution, reverence to distance. Where earlier believers might have felt spiritually connected to the successor of St. Peter, later medieval Christians often felt only the weight of obligation. Obedience persisted, but it was drained of warmth. The papacy ruled through continuity, law, and fear of disruption, not through love or moral attraction. Authority survived, but intimacy vanished. The Church remained central to life, yet its centre felt strangely hollow. The long history of scandal also changed how failure itself was interpreted. Instead of seeing corruption as a betrayal of ideals, many began to treat it as an inevitable feature of power. This fatalism discouraged hope for genuine reform. If corruption was assumed to be permanent, then resistance felt pointless. Reformers were admired for their courage, but doubted for their chances of success. The system appeared too old, too entrenched, too practiced in survival to be fundamentally altered. Scandal had not destroyed authority. It had taught people that authority could endure almost anything. Over time, this belief reshaped moral imagination. People learned to distinguish between spiritual truth and institutional behavior so sharply that the two rarely touched. Christianity became something practiced, despite leadership rather than because of it. Personal piety flourished precisely because institutional trust weakened. Prayer, fasting, devotion to saints, and mystical experience offered refuge from disappointment, allowing believers to bypass the papal court entirely in their search for meaning. Faith survived by retreating inward. The papacy itself seemed caught in a cycle. It could not escape. Each attempt to assert control reinforced the very image that caused distrust. Threats, punishments, and displays of power confirmed suspicions that Rome relied on force rather than example. Each indulgence sought to fund authority, weaken the moral logic used to defend that authority. The more the papacy tried to preserve itself through coercion, the more it demonstrated the absence of moral confidence. Power became both shield and evidence of failure. This dynamic affected how time itself was perceived. The Church claimed eternal continuity, yet its leaders appeared trapped in repetitive patterns of ambition and compromise. History no longer felt like a story of progress toward holiness, but like a cycle of scandal and survival. People remembered previous failures whenever new promises were made. Memory became a brake on belief, slowing enthusiasm and deepening caution. Hope remained, but it was restrained by experience. The irony is that medieval Christianity remained deeply serious about sin, judgment, and salvation. Fear of damnation was intense, and moral discipline was demanded of ordinary people. This seriousness only sharpened the contrast with papal behavior. The more intensely believers feared divine judgment, the more perplexing papal immunity appeared. If salvation required repentance, why did those closest to God seem least bound by it? This question lingered quietly, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. As a result, the papacy became an institution people negotiated with rather than trusted. Its authority was acknowledged, but its motives were scrutinized. Its commands were obeyed, but its sincerity was doubted. This negotiation shaped everyday religious life, creating a culture of compliance without conviction. People learned how to live faithfully within a system they no longer fully believed in. Adaptation replaced trust as the primary survival skill. The cumulative effect of this long medieval experience was not disbelief, but disillusionment. Christianity endured because it offered meaning beyond institutions. But the papacy endured as something separate. As this long medieval experience settled into collective consciousness, the papacy became something people learned to endure rather than trust. A constant presence whose moral authority was assumed to be fragile by default. The sheer repetition of contradiction reshaped belief at a subconscious level. People no longer expected alignment between words and actions at the top of the church. Instead, they developed a quiet realism that separated spiritual truth from institutional behavior. This was not rebellion in the modern sense, but adaptation. Faith survived by lowering its expectations of leadership, and devotion learned to exist independently of Rome's example. One of the most profound consequences of this history was the transformation of obedience itself. Earlier Christian obedience had been rooted in reverence and moral confidence. By the later Middle Ages, obedience increasingly functioned as a survival strategy. People complied with papal demands, not because they believed the Pope embodied divine wisdom, but because resistance carried unbearable consequences.